All right, welcome everybody. It is the Kubernetes community meeting. It is Thursday, July 28th, 2018. I am your host today, Jay Singer-Dumars. I work at Google, and we're going to have the regular community meeting today and a special thing that happens every 3 months, which is the release retrospective, where we have some high-level discussions about what happened during these last 3 months as we've created the next iteration of Kubernetes. So to get started, if somebody in the audience is feeling adventurous and wants to take notes, that would be super helpful. You won't need to do it for the retro, just for the first part of it. So we're going to start with a demo of Containerd from Phil Estes. Phil, take it.
All right. I have a few slides, so let me share my screen. Can someone tell me if that is coming through well, full screen?
Looks good.
Looks good.
It's coming through well. All right. All right. So yeah, let me, I'm getting some echo. I don't know if that's someone else talking or background. All right, so I got roped into this because I think Justin Cormack from Docker signed up for it, and then he was traveling today. So hopefully this will fit what Justin was going to show you. I'm going to try and kind of briefly go over Containerd and then show a demo of a cluster that's running Containerd as a runtime underneath Kubernetes. So brief background: Containerd has been around for a couple of years. It existed about the time that runc and the OCI work started up Docker. Specifically, Michael Crosby created it as a supervisor for runc processes, so Docker would be disconnected from driving runc directly. In the last year and a half, that was spun out into a more formal project. Several other contributors got involved, and then it was contributed to the CNCF last March. And so I assume everyone kind of knows that background. Obviously, the idea is, hey, Containerd could be useful as a stable runtime without Docker's sort of opinionated client and other pieces, just the runtime, just driving the OCI runc binary with Containerd 1.0 added the additional features needed by, for example, the CRI with image, registry interactions, which didn't exist in the original Containerd project. Like I said, has been going for quite a few years now. A good number of contributors over time. This data is roughly accurate, but of course, because Containerd existed long before the Containerd 1.0 project, long in a relative sense, because we're talking about an extra year or so, but about the first half of its life had some activity from folks who no longer contribute. Obviously, with Red Hat focusing on Creo, they aren't truly contributing to Containerd, but obviously had some activity here as well. It's in the CNCF, overseen by Moby Technical Steering Committee, which is separate from Docker's original BDFL model. Obviously, the intention of Containerd was to kind of rethink some of the original Docker engine decisions around design. So a lot of us feel it has a cleaner, of course, all gRPC-based design with discrete components. The main focus being just run OCI containers, don't get involved in abstracting that. So OCI is a straight pass-through, and if we have enough time to dig that far, you'll see that when Kubernetes CRI calls through Containerd or any other runtime, it's just an OCI spec that's not modified or re-abstracted by Containerd. A lot of focus around stability and performance and decoupling these various systems that in the Docker engine over the years had become a little too tightly coupled. Currently, we're at 1.10, released back in April. We have a 1.11 that's in RC available this week. 1.2 is kind of our next point release. adding more complete Windows support and a few other things coming in there. Obviously, the key here is that unlike Docker's release process, there's a lot more formal statement of support around Containerd, a lot more support of prior point releases, including backporting fixes. Obviously, Docker continues to use Containerd. They switched to the Containerd 1.x code base as of late last year. Although Docker doesn't use all the features of Containerd, there's still refactoring that has to happen for Docker to get rid of some code and use Containerd's implementation. For example, snapshot drivers, which replaces the graph driver concept in Docker proper. Obviously, we're going to look at the Kubernetes CRI and the CRI plugin, which was a separate project, now part of the Containerd upstream GitHub project. Linux Kit and Build Kit, projects you may or may not have heard of, are heavy users of Containerd as well. The Cloud Foundry community has a runC based executor that they're proposing moving to Containerd. We have people at IBM on the OpenWhisk serverless framework looking at using Containerd as an executor versus the Docker engine, and there are other companies, Puppets, using it as well. The main focus obviously here is that our CRI plugin makes it a viable runtime for Kubernetes. You can see that effectively, I'll skip talking about this because there was a great blog post that came out last month about the integration going GA. Lantau from Google and Mike from IBM contributed to this, and there's a lot of great information in there about the design and architecture and some performance metrics of using Docker versus Containerd as the runtime. Where things are today, you can obviously deploy Containerd via Kelsey's the hard way repo. As far as public clouds, GKE came out with their alpha release. You can deploy an alpha supported Containerd cluster. IBM, we're currently using, testing Kubernetes 1.11, which of course was released yesterday, in staging using Containerd, and that'll be something we push to production later this year. Gabe from Microsoft mentioned that AKS is definitely moving to Containerd at some point. You can already see some of that deployment technology in their ACS engine project. They will use Creo for their OpenShift partnership, where you can deploy OpenShift onto Azure. And Amazon, I believe, is still reviewing their runtime options, still uses the Docker engine for deployed clusters today, and I already mentioned Cloud Foundry. So that was slide content. Can everyone see this command prompt?
Yes, and just to be clear, we have about a minute for this demo. So
okay, yeah, I hate to say I can't make an exciting demo out of container runtimes underneath Kubernetes, so this can be as quick as we want. I'm sitting on a worker node in, actually it's IBM Cloud. We've got Containerd here, a cluster effectively named Containerd that has 2 worker nodes. I'm logged into one of the 2 worker nodes. Obviously, you can see the Kubernetes 1.11. You can see I don't have Docker installed here, but obviously there's many Containerd processes running, including everything that's running the pods. So if I do cri cuddle ps, we can see again the dashboard, Nginx, other pods running here. And if I use the Containerd client, we can also see that same view through Containerd. So obviously, Containerd is driving the workloads on this Kubernetes cluster, and obviously we could deploy things. We could Containerd has Grafana-based our Prometheus endpoint, which you can connect to Grafana and look at all kinds of interesting metrics. But I think we're basically out of time, so I'll stop there. And if there are any questions, and if we have time for that, I'm happy to to answer them.
Well, let's go ahead and have questions in chat while the retro is happening, and just do those asynchronously.
Cool.
For time. Thank you so much, Phil. That was a great demo, and you did make Containerd more interesting than I've imagined it could be. So thank you for that.
All right.
All right, so we're gonna whip through the announcements real quick. So SIG, IBM Cloud, Autoscaling, GCP are going to be updating in August as a concession to today's retro, taking that space. GitHub groups, George, you've got exactly 2 minutes.
Yes, there's a pull request there that you want to link to. We have 303 GitHub teams, and that's not becoming very workable. So Christoph has opened a proposal for us to look at how we're organizing that and try to make something sane out of it. So please follow through if you have strong opinions onto the link. Thank you.
Fantastic. And shoutouts. This is a very busy shoutout season because of the release and all the great things happening. So shoutouts, Josh, to Jordan Liggett for diagnosing and fixing the controller performance issue that has haunted us since last August, and to Julia Evans for reporting the original issue. Another +1 to Jordan Liggett for always helping anyone with an auth question in the channel of kindness, also echoed by myself. I had a shout out to Paris. Thank you for all of your work helping to keep our community safe and inclusive. I know that you've spent countless hours refining our Zoom usage, documenting, testing, and generally being super proactive on this. People have no idea how much you do, Paris, behind the scenes, and thank you so much for that. Nikita, shout out to Christoph Blecker for excellent meme skills. That is absolutely true. Mr. Bobby Tables, just want to give a big shout out to the whole release team. Thank you for your effort in getting 111 out the door. Slightly smiling face, seriously great job. Misty, to Andrew Chen for last minute 111 docs related heroics, to Nick Chase for amazing release notes, to Josh Burkus for being a very patient and available release lead. This was Misty's first time on the release team, although you would never know it because Misty did the most amazing stuff. Thank you, Misty, for all that. Josh, to Jordan for last minute cherry pick shepherding, and to Nick Chase for marathon release note slog. Yes. Josh, to a whole bunch of people. Truly, this is the 111 release team. He says best release team yet. As a former release team leader, I think we've had all great release teams, but you can say that, Josh, I totally get it. And the release team back at Josh, amazing leadership, Josh. And I felt so confident turning the release process over to you. Thank you for all of your hard work. That was truly impressive. And to everybody else, the thousands of contributors during the release process, this is my personal thanks to you for all of the things that you did, for all the hours that you spent maintaining our high level of trust between the Kubernetes project and the people who use Kubernetes for their livelihoods. So, all right, without further ado, we're going to roll into the release retrospective. There's a link in the community meeting notes to the retro doc. I'm not going to screen share. I'm just going to go ahead and go through it. So screen share along if you'd like, and we'll go from there. So one thing we're doing differently this time in our spirit of iteration is that we are paring down the main points of the release retrospective that are sort of at a higher community level and going over those in this meeting as opposed to depth analysis of all the things. And the reason we want to do that is just for time's sake, and also that SIG release originally was supposed to be organized around making the release process better. So a lot of these deep comments and feedback mechanisms are better served by SIG release. So FYI, this is probably how we're going to do it moving forward. I will make a personal note. This is the 2-year anniversary of the first release retrospective I held for the Kubernetes project. So back in 2016, this is how this all started. So it's nice to see it still happening and still thriving. So first up, we're going to go through things that worked and we should do again. But before I do, I just want to say that if you are participating in the retro, please be respectful of other people's feelings, opinions, and with your communication, be solution oriented. Make sure that you mute when you're not speaking, and respect time boxes. And if you have some sort of concerns about anything that's happening in this retrospective, please private message myself or Paris and let her know so that we can intervene if you feel like this is not a safe environment for you to share your feelings, or that you feel that something that is happening in this retrospective is not in alignment with your needs. So please do that. And moving forward, Zach, are you on the call?
I am indeed.
I'll let you kick it off with what worked well.
Cool. Thanks. I loved the more aggressive docs deadline than 110. I wasn't part of the 110 process, but I personally thought that when we had the real push to make sure that everything that was going to be merged was already documented, then it kind of forced a higher level of quality through, I think, the code, and even I think it continued to push us forward. And we actually hit every single deadline. I think the release was off by 1 day, which, I mean, for 3 months out, I think is absolutely incredible. And lots of things contributed to it, but I just thought the more aggressive docs deadline certainly contributed to making sure, like, okay, we know exactly what's going on, because if it's well documented, then you know pretty much what your feature is going to look like. When docs come like right at the end, it's like, okay, I can wait. I didn't make it, never mind.
Cool, thank you. Tim, I believe you had a comment?
So I generally agree with the practice, but I think the reality behind a lot of situations is that the documentation either falls out of lags the release entirely, or is not part of the actual PR itself. If we had a blocking change that says before your feature can go to beta, or before your feature can get to alpha state, your docs are required as part of this, that would be a forcing function to actually ensure that we have docs for said feature. But instead, we kind of, what's actually missed here is that there's probably a bunch of stuff that went in that it wasn't documented at all, because there's always a push at the end of the cycle to get the code in, right? And because the docs freeze was at a date right near the code freeze, I'm almost certain that this is the case, right? I'd have to dig through the code to get a handle on it, but I'm pretty sure, given history, that this is probably what has transpired.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think Josh Burkus also had an alternative, like going beyond just the features tracking spreadsheet that we had. He had a 111 milestone PR spreadsheet, and individually went through almost every single day, looked at every PR and said, okay, this looks like it might need docs, this might not, this one maybe, I'm not sure. And we made sure to follow up with everybody that looked like it would probably need documentation. But I think you're right, it does pose a problem, Tim.
Cool. So if somebody can actually make a note of that and the things we would change, just to make sure that's fully documented.
There's actually related things we could change items. So if you want to just add a comment on that.
And I don't want to get into solutioning right now. We're not quite there yet. So let's go ahead and continue with what went well.
So Nick,
you're up next.
Yep.
Next three.
So this time we did an experiment. So one of the things that's been happening over the last few cycles is that code freeze has been getting longer and longer in order to have the release be stable by the time that we release. And so we tried an experiment this time, which is to say, hey, let's focus on stability a month out from code freeze. And if we're stable, there's no reason to have a long code freeze. And we did that, and I think it worked. It gave everybody a little bit more time to work on development, and they certainly were, because the number of PRs we had literally hours before code freeze started was huge. This is up to Tim, of course, but I think we can plan on sticking to a shorter code freeze. Now, there are other things we want to tinker with in the schedule that we'll get to later on, but I think the shorter code freeze was a success and something we should try to stick with.
Tim Sinclair.
I think the reason the shorter code freeze was good in this cycle is because Aish did an awesome job as the test signal lead. I think without that, it probably wouldn't have gone as well. So shout out to Aish there, as well as if we want to be able to make this productive, we need somebody who can manage that workload.
Thanks. Yes, and I have a point towards that after this.
Josh, you want to hit your other couple points and then we'll hand it over to Aish?
Yeah, so Well, yeah, there's one of the parts of that, by the way, was one of the things that delayed the 110 release was performance scalability issues that didn't even get looked at until code freeze. And so this time we made sure to look at those early. And then the SIG scalability team, particularly Shyam and Wojciech, stepped up and created a performance pre-submit as part of our acceptance testing. And the result was that passing the performance test became a non-concern for this release, and did not result in delays. So that was awesome.
Great. That is for sure. Let's see. So Aish, you want to hit the next thing?
So this was my first release. So as part of being at the risk of being over verbose, I started sending out the CI signal reports every week, which I think helped in two ways. It helped me as a signal lead to actually scrub the different issues regularly on a weekly basis versus like looking at it at the last minute. And also it really, I think, helped get a lot of SIGs and developer attention on these issues early in the game. And as Josh and Tim were saying, this really helped us. This went a long way in actually making the code freeze shorter. So one thing that I would like to propose, again, it depends on the CI lead and depends on each release team, is sending out these reports as part of the signal lead, CI signal lead workload itself, because I believe this will really help folks to get early insight into the failures and stabilize things way faster.
Yeah. Well, one of the other things I actually want to comment on this, the other reason why that worked, and I want to thank everybody, was that when Aish went to the various SIGs, SIG cluster lifecycle and node and that sort of thing, with these early failing test results, people responded. People did not blow her off and say, well, we're still 4 weeks out, 5 weeks out from code freeze. I'll look at that later. They responded and they actually fixed the problems. And so that's like a big thank you to all of our contributors for treating stuff as urgent, even if it wasn't yet code freeze.
Yes, completely agree with that.
Josh, you've got the next one.
Oh yeah, in addition to Aish's CI reports, so there's two things. One is, in addition to Aish's CI reports, I actually put out some periodic release status reports, just what was going on with the release and release status. I didn't really get a sense from any kind of feedback anywhere, either on Discuss or email, whether or not anybody was reading those. And so that's wondering whether or not it's worth the next release lead actually doing them, because I'm not sure anyone's actually reading them. So if you were reading them, if you got something out of them, please put something in the chat. The other thing that we changed this time around was we had a couple of people in the team on different continents in the release team. Plus we have in our contributor base a wider variety of people and time zones around the world. So both for release team meetings, the early once a week meetings, and then later on for the more frequent burn down meetings, we alternated time slots. And that allowed some people to attend those meetings without taking a meeting at 9 p.m. their time, or worse yet, 2 a.m. their time, which I felt was more inclusive and allowed us to actually get direct input from people who were critical to the release.
Great. Ihor, looks like you're in the call. Do you want to mention your thing? If not, I'll go ahead.
I'd just like to mention that the features process that hasn't been definitely changed during the long time. It hasn't been changed for around 2 years, and finally with this release, we have started moving forward with slightly enhancing it and adapting it to the current realities, because 2 years ago, the entire Kubernetes world, entire Kubernetes contributors and development world was totally different. So this time I'd like to make a shout out to Steven Augustus, who was the features shadow, and he made a huge number of enhancements to the current features process and did a huge amount of job behind the scenes. Would also like to see this progress moving forward with the upcoming releases. Especially, we had a few questions. Why do we need a feature freeze? And probably we can't deprecate it at all. So it's another item for the upcoming discussion. But I definitely would like to see the feature process enhancing in the future releases.
Great, thanks, Igor. Tim says in chat, also on features, Misty's probing for, does this feature have docs from early on was a notable positive? Yes. Hugely yes. Positive.
Yes.
All right. So moving on to the meat of the retro for things we need to change. So this is really our opportunity to identify areas that could be improved. So I just want to reiterate that it's easy to get sort of bogged down in negative feelings about things sometimes, because there are points where it's frustration or challenging. As we go through this, just please remember to be solution focused and positive as much as possible. And let's solve these problems together as a community, and that's why we're talking about it in this forum. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Josh and Timothy Sinclair to talk about the first one about code freeze. You may have already covered it, but let's just give it a second.
Yeah, well, actually, I have 3 related items. And I'll say this, but I got input from Timothy, from Tim Pepper, and from Aish on all of these, which is we're sort of tinkering around where the various things that have to happen concurrently for the release go. So we shortened code freeze this time, but as Timothy brought up, this introduced a problem in that the first draft or final draft docs deadline was actually the day before code freeze started, which for people rushing to beat the code freeze deadline for their code was kind of a problem. And then the other thing that Aish came in with a suggestion later on, once we got past code freeze, is that the sort of 6 working days we currently have in there for code thaw, that is the time between we end code freeze and the time that we release, is not really long enough, because it takes like almost 48 hours for the submit queue to clear. Now, that may be different once we move to Tide. It may be less of an issue once we move to Tide, but the result was in this cycle, we ended code freeze, and then we literally didn't know what anything looked like for 48 hours because we were waiting for the submit queue. And so that left us with only 4 working days to deal with any fallout from that, which was not really enough, and we ended up delaying the release by 1 day. And the delay could have been worse if that delay had been the result of anything other than flaky tests. So one of the suggestions to shuffle this whole thing of when docs are due and still having a shorter code freeze and everything else would be to keep a shorter code freeze, but to have a longer code thaw. That is a longer period between end of code freeze and actual release. And so that's kind of the proposal there. I don't have a specific proposal number of days. That's kind of up to Tim Pepper. But that's what we took out of, continuing to improve the schedule. Tim, Aish, Timothy, just one of you want to add comments on that?
I think everything you said is accurate and correct. I do think that I think there's some process we need to refine with regards to feature promotion and docs to make it clear to developers when and how we should expect documentation, and also like what things we want to document, because I think there's like some fuzziness that exists with what we consider a feature, right? And what is user facing and what requires documentation. That fuzziness and that ambiguity, I think, is the reason for, we had problems in SIG cluster lifecycle in that we were deciding the last minute changes at the last minute, right? So I just want to make sure that I put that point out there.
Yeah, and towards having the longer stabilization, we can always release early if the thaw seems really good. But yeah, having slightly more than just 6 days there looks like it might be needed in some cases.
Great.
I think in addition to docs potentially coming after code, test cases don't always flow in with code as well. So that becomes a challenge as we're trying to figure out which test adds do we add potentially to stabilizing things. Do we make them blocking or not? And and balancing and having sufficient understanding of the scope and depth of the feature overlaps across SIGs and implications is the thing. Just alpha versus stable. Having a lot of communication there is important for the release team to be able to manage those choices.
Great. In terms of release schedule, is there anything else that needs to be covered here?
So there was a suggestion of adding 2 more freeze dates to the official freeze dates of the schedule. These are things where we don't have an official, sort of end date for. And I think that we actually need one in the calendar. One of them is a test freeze date. That is a firm date that says, after today, any test changes that are not bug fixes to the existing tests will be held until after release or after code thaw. Probably after release, actually, because we still look at the test and code thaw. And the second, this was Aisha's suggestion, was we need a deadline for cherry picks in relation to the actual release. Because we were still having people submit cherry picks 12 hours before the release. And frankly, in some cases, they could have done it a little bit earlier, but since we didn't give them a deadline, there was, we can't blame them for submitting them late. So, and so that's just a suggestion, is to add some more deadlines to the schedule.
Great. And I assume probably the actual steps to be taken there and will be reflected in the pull request for the schedule timeline. Is that?
Yeah. This will all be part of Tim's sort of setting up the calendar, and so look for email and discuss post, etc., from Tim with the new calendar, because there will be changes to it that make it different from the 110 and 111 calendars. And if you don't like the changes, that's when you'll need to speak up, not waiting until those deadlines actually hit.
Okay. I would love to put a to-do to come back to the community meeting to just do a quick touch base on that when it's out for comment, just so we can get a wider view, because this has a lot of impact to the contributor community. So I just want to understand it. All right. So let's move on to feature freeze and feature tracking as a meta item here, and then there's some things under this that looks like Josh, Misty, Ihor, and Stephen have. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Josh. And do you mind sort of curating the conversation on this?
Yeah. So, I'm particularly, we're going to take the first part of this, which is the sort of feature freeze date and schedule, and then we'll take the documentation part of it, which is a different but frankly related problem. So feature freeze schedule. So this is me, Ihor, Stephen. Is Stephen on the call? Stephen, are you here? Okay, that would be a no. So what I observed is we started out, we have this feature freeze date that's like a month out from code slash. And a whole bunch of big things get listed as features on that feature freeze date. Now, part of the reason for that used to be for comms and PR. But because of what I observed after that, comms and PR stopped putting out blog posts based on the feature freeze information, because there was so much that would change about it. Because basically, we had this list originally of, I believe, 43 features, of which 18 got dropped before the release. They got pushed off to 112. Something else happened because of whatever problems with their development. So that's, almost half of them I got pulled out of the release. In the meantime, a bunch of other things that people had not really expected to finish for 111, they got to, a week out, 3 days, 4 days out from code slash, and they're like, hey, this is basically done. Can we still get it in? And so I really feel like this process that we have of having this declarative feature freeze in which all the SIGs are supposed to list their features by this date a month out from code slash is not really working the way that's intended to work. Like, it's intended to give us a way to track which things are going to be the features that we absolutely need to have docs for, that we absolutely need to have tests for, that we need to mention in the blog posts and everything. And it's not. because we're both losing a lot of the things that are declared, and we're getting things that are not declared, and then we have trouble keeping track of. So I feel like we need to change that process somehow. I'm just not all that sure on how. Ihor?
Yeah, just would like to second everything that you said here. So initially, we've established the feature freeze deadline mostly from the marketing perspective, because our goal was to understand what other features going to be present in the release and what we're going to see in this release. And actually, it was the best time to start working with the marketing team from CNCF and marketing teams from other companies who are involved in the release process from the marketing perspective. At the same time, from my experience, in every Kubernetes release, we had similar issues as Josh has just mentioned. So we had some defined list of features, around 40 features, so 35 features every time with every Kubernetes release. But in the next few weeks before the code freeze, we had some of them removed from the milestone, moved to the next milestone because they haven't been finished in time. And we also had a few new proposed because they have been delivered without any notification and so. So we probably can simply remove the feature freeze deadline, but my question is there any other release team and release subgroup that will be affected from this except the marketing people?
Well, pretty much, I mean, the big things are testing and docs, right? Because if something is a new feature, it needs to have documentation. And it probably needs to have test coverage, not just unit tests, but also in the test grid. And so the feature tracking sheet has been our way to track it. And this ties into the second problem, and this is where I'm going to call on Misty as well, which is one of the other problems is that we sort of treat these as two different things, as in you've got major features that need all of this tracking, and then you have other stuff that doesn't. The problem is that we have a lot of things that a lot of PRs that involve API changes or that involve minor changes to a user interface, like they're changing a command line switch. And those things nevertheless need documentation. They might need changes to tests, and we're not tracking that right now. If they don't rise to the level of listed feature, the tracking of that is very ad hoc. And it's difficult for the release team to do because they have to do things like what I was doing, which is checking on the PRs after they go in and making a judgment call on whether or not those things needed docs or tests, and then trying to get somebody to pay attention to those, and it's not very effective. So I feel like we still need something to accomplish the goal, right? We need something that allows us to track major features and minor features as soon as possible, like even from the time that somebody thinks they're going to have them done, even if it means they cancel them later, so that we do track docs and tests and eventually marketing for these.
I'd like to make a quick suggestion on this, because I was thinking about the same thing with regards to release notes and whether or not something needs to have release notes. One place where we can ask for help with this is to ask reviewers to make sure that these things are tagged properly. So I was going to suggest that rather than, if you're a reviewer and somebody says to you, can you LGTM this for me? Part of the process should be looking at it and seeing whether it should have a release note and whether it's tagged properly, or whether you just put in release note none because you're too busy to put in a release note. We could include with that process, needs tests or, needs docs or whatever. And then we'll at least have some way to pull everything that needs all that stuff without the release lead having to look at every single PR that comes in.
Yeah. I love that. This is Misty. I love that suggestion. Release notes are really hard. And sometimes the person writing the code doesn't even know if something needs a release note, but I think that rather than saying no, if you don't know, maybe reach out to the docs team or reach out to the release team to try to help you figure it out. I know that Josh had asked my feedback on the issue of tracking things that are not tracked in Kubernetes/features. And I think, well, like we had problems from both sides on this one because we had, like, I think it was almost half of the things that were tagged as features didn't make it in. So that seems like it doesn't necessarily help marketing to plan either, if that was the original intent. And also there were several things that were late breaking surprises because they got in through a SIG, but they weren't tracked in the features, and they were features, like effectively they were features. And we had to like figure out, did this thing actually make it into 111 or not in a couple of places? And that's kind of distracting. And it also points to the fact that that thing might not have test coverage. It might not have like cross SIG buy-in. So maybe you put in a feature, but it's going to break somebody else in unexpected ways. So it seems like there is definitely a communication gap. I'm not necessarily proposing a solution because I'm pretty new to this project. So I think we're doing great, but we can definitely do better.
Great. So we sort of jumped around a little bit in terms of the things that can be improved there, but was there anything more that you want to cover on this area, Josh, before we move on to the next?
No, just, you know, as usual with these things where we identify stuff that really needs to change, people should be aware of, should look out for, probably in a community meeting. I'll leave this up to Tim, how Tim is going to tackle this in terms of the 112 cycle. But number one, if anyone has any ideas of how we could do this differently, please jump on SIG release and suggest them. And then look for communications from Tim Pepper about how we're going to change the process.
Yes. And for those who haven't heard the news, Tim Pepper is the release lead for 1.12, and Aish is his shadow. Oh my gosh, this is like, I can't wait to see this release. I'm super excited.
Yeah. Oh yeah. By the way, that was actually something I meant to put in on the things that are going well. That I forgot to put in, which is that the amazing thing this time is we have a next cycle release team, pretty much completely staffed before code freeze was even over. And so this means that the 111 release team is turning over stuff directly to the next generation release team, which is awesome and something I think we ought to make a habit out of.
Yes, I was pushing for that since 1.4.
Yeah, and the good thing about the new team is that almost the full new team is from the existing shadow members from the previous release iterations, especially from 1.11. And coming back to the features question, also Steven Augustus, who was shadow features shadow for the previous release, is going to be a lead in the upcoming release, and he's the best person to work on the new feature guidance. So please work with him on your suggestions. How can we enhance the features process? I'm stepping down this time, so please do it in a best way.
I'm also really happy that we have a lot of folks who volunteered to shadow. This hopefully seeds a pipeline and gets that turnover going in future releases where we have people who are involved from prior ones more so.
Yes, this is so positive to see the staffing happening, and this was a dream. Literally 2 years ago, I had dreamed of the day where this could happen, and it's happening, and that is not a trivial thing. So thank you all for that.
I don't know whose idea the shadow system was, but that was a brilliant idea.
It wasn't mine. I think it might have been Phil Whitrock or maybe Caleb. By the way, Caleb sends his regards. He wasn't able to attend today, but he said he was really wished that he could be here amongst everybody. Caleb gets a shout out for being amazing. The branch manager job is very, very time consuming and difficult. It's very complicated. So shout out to that, because that's no small job. Testing. Josh, do you want to take the next video?
So first of all, I think I've actually got 2 items that are basically the same thing here. I just pasted stuff in, but so this is a project for improvement to the process. This is something we've never done before, and for some future release cycle, somebody ought to take this on, and it will require somebody actually making a commitment that this is their thing, which is getting the betas and RCs tested. Because right now, if somebody random jumps into Kubernetes users on Slack and said, hey, I've got some free time, I use Kubernetes, I'm interested in helping test the betas, what do? We have no answer for them. Like, we don't even have installation instructions for the betas. So this would require working with the Kubeadmin team and working preferably with the vendors. Like, you know, we ought to have OpenShift and Google and Amazon and other vendors picking at least some of the betas and or RCs and making them available on their platform to try out. Because, you know, only a minority of our users are actually installing Kubernetes based on downloading the source packages. So in order to actually get some general user testing of the betas. So that's something we should look at in the future, but that's going to depend on somebody, like an additional person jumping into the release team and saying, you know, I'm really going to make beta testing my thing.
This is kind of a meta problem, that the release artifacts are not all published as part of every single thing we do. And there's kind of a separation of concerns. It would be ideal if we try to push this so that any Bazel build that anyone could do would be equivalent to all the artifacts necessary for a person to be able to beta test.
Yeah.
Yes. Big +1. Aish, did you want to tackle the next couple things?
Sure. So this is specifically around upgrade testing. So currently the upgrade downgrade tests, they're not part of our release blocking, the release blocking dashboard. But as part of one of the action items we took, we started looking into them quite early in the game. But towards the end, they kind of became the long pole because these tests were not historically always green. There were a lot of flakes in them, but the fact that we were looking at them continuously, we were expecting them to stabilize, and this was the reason we had a day's delay as well. So I would like to understand how blocking the upgrade test should really be. And as part of this, in 112, probably weed out the flaky ones, and also the ones that are not necessarily Kubernetes release blocking, the GKE ones, and then put them in the appropriate dashboards so that more directly responsible teams can take a look at it on a regular basis. So that was one of the action items we wanted to follow up on in 112. And also, there are a bunch of kubeadmin upgrade tests that the cluster lifecycle they constantly monitor. I wasn't even looking at the dashboard until into code freeze when I learned about it. So probably if we want that code part to be monitored, then we also should somehow bring that into the blocking or have some visibility into those results as well.
So one of the other areas also for something that I think we should definitely move out of blocking tests, which is I think we need to move external tests out of blocking tests. And this is mainly GKE, but it's not only GKE because during the cycle, we had somebody submit an E2E test that would have run entirely on Red Hat internal hardware. And I blocked that for 111 for that reason, because the problem is if a test isn't passing, the release team needs to know why. And if the release team doesn't happen to also be on the team for that external test host, then we can't get an answer in a reasonable amount of time.
Yeah, and there is a proposal out. I need to make sure it gets circulated wider, but a proposal out on admission criteria for blocking tests and also the criteria about pulling them out when they don't pass a certain number of times. So we should probably look at that for 112. So
and so the really hard part about this is going to be, honestly, the upgrade tests, because we're in a situation where if you actually look at the history of upgrade and downgrade tests, the majority of them fail most of the time for reasons that have nothing to do with what code has been checked in. So if we move the flaky tests out of there, we're going to discover that we really need new upgrade and downgrade tests, whether they're based on kubeadmin or otherwise.
Right.
I would like to add that I would think that we would restrict what tests are in there based on how responsive they are, because that, like for example, we have the OpenStack conformance tests on there right now, and DIMS maintains those along with a few other folks over there. They're very responsive, and that signal has been good.
Okay.
And it's allowed us to cross-reference. So I'm not sure that necessarily like external is a problem so much as unresponsive test maintaining.
Yeah. So, but it's a question of, there's questions of whether or not the tests are in there and whether or not the tests are blocking. And I think we need to actually have that discussion longer because, I mean, like, for example, I happen to know that my colleagues at Red Hat are generally very responsive. But imagine if these tests that need to run on OpenShift stuff and need to be directly admin by Red Hat staff who may not be in SIG release this cycle. Imagine they start failing during Red Hat Summit. We're not going to hear anything from anybody for a week and a half. And I think that will be an issue with, because the thing is, for tests that run on stuff that is controlled by test infra, we can always get somebody else to take a look at it. But for the external tests, it's often not possible to get somebody else.
Yeah, so I think that goes actually more to having a formulated SLA. And so basically that, again, that if your tests fail and you're blocking for 3 days in a row, then your tests are going to get yanked out and you're going to have to lobby with a number of successive positive test runs to get back in. So, I mean, we just have to have, this is ultimately a very human-oriented process, and there's not much we can do about that. So we just have to have ways of dealing with situations where humans are flawed, which they will always be, and we just create solutions to help make that job easier, I think.
It's also slightly confusing in that it's a volunteer army, and not all the owners change over time.
Right.
So the owner of some of the /cluster directory is pretty much Google, and it's in a SIG's wheelhouse, but the owner kind of shifts over time, and they may have shifted responsibilities. So, like, I think keeping the owner references up to date as part of evaluation. If you see a CI signal and you had a trouble finding a person to own it, we should update the owner references so that way we know next time that that is the person we can go to, right?
Plus 1,000, absolutely keeping those current is huge. And you look at the success of release roles. I mean, we're passing huge critical parts of the project around to different people successfully. That means this can be done. There is absolutely a model through which this works, and we can do that. Aisha, you look like you have something to say.
Yeah, I've been, as part of my learnings in the past few months, I've been putting a table of like this SIG, this person is most responsive, ownership. I don't know where to publish it. A and B, keeping it up to date, evolving it is also a challenge, but maybe it's something that can be handed over from one CI lead to the other so that at least there's some amount of history you can go back to and trace. Yeah.
That's great. We're running out of time. We've got 6 minutes and there's 2 relatively large sections left, docs being a huge one. I would like to turn over the remaining time to docs, if that's okay, because this is a big deal. That okay with you, Josh and Tim? Do you feel like that's a good use of time? Okay.
Yeah, and I think the other issues are sort of thorny and indeterminate. Things like the proliferation of labels. I don't think we're going to get a resolution for here because that's been a problem for the project. So yes, let's do the rest docs.
Okay. So I'm turning over to you and Misty and Nick and whoever else. And before we go on to there, I gotta say one shout out to Caitlin, who did an amazing job on the communications, the blogs. The consistent quality of those has been phenomenal, and to CNCF for sponsoring that. She had not gotten any props yet, and that is not good because she's amazing, and super big props to Caitlin. Thank you.
Okay, so the first part of the docs thing is, I'm going to suggest there's 2 policies we need. As far as I know, these policies don't exist. At least I couldn't find them with searching, and I couldn't find anybody who knew where they were. One is we do not have a policy for what needs to be listed in the release notes as a dependency version, because we change the versions of things in GoDeps, we change the versions of external dependencies every release. What needs to be listed, what does not need to be listed, there is no policy for. I did go to SIG Architecture about this, and they said they weren't ready to write a policy. My suggestion is, since SIG release needs this urgently, is that SIG release will draft a policy, and then at some point SIG Architecture will revise it. The second one where we don't have a policy is, as far as I know, we do not have, a policy, a guide for what needs a release note and what doesn't need a release note. Like, I was going over the sort of what I regard as the misuse of release note none, and then I'm like, how can I call it misuse when we haven't told somebody what the rules are? So we need to write down the rules of this needs a release note if, because right now we're leaving it up to people's opinion, which results in both things like API changes not having a release note and things that are completely internal changes having incomprehensible release notes. And we need a policy for that. Anybody's interested in working on that, obviously, come over to SIG release. Otherwise, I'll work with Doc's team on those things.
Great. Misty, looks like you're up.
What did I do?
Basically saying at the end of the release cycle, the devs might not even remember what they did it, or how do we?
Yeah, because it seems to me that if you have written your code and you've tested your code and you haven't written any docs, it just seems to me like we actually surface problems with features while writing and reviewing docs. So it would, like, the draft of docs that we need from the devs is not that onerous. Like, we can work with a back of the napkin kind of thing. It would be great to have that as early on as possible. It seems like something that the dev could be like working on as they're doing the code. That was just my suggestion, to try to start thinking about docs for your feature early. It can actually help clarify for you what your feature, how your feature is supposed to work, and the ergonomics and things like that. So I just wanted to put that out there.
And I think it's also easier mechanically because the docs team has chosen to do effectively a feature branch, a topic branch for the upcoming release. And I'm an advocate of that for features. I think it makes integration and visibility and iterative improvement of something much easier.
Yes. So then it looks like the next was from Lucas regarding collaboration in docs versus Markdown, and then there's the follow-on, which actually is a suggestion for how to fix that for HackMD as a source doing that.
I'm going to kind of jump in here and say I completely agree with Lucas. We tried that as an experiment, and it clearly did not work. So.
Oh, HackMD did not work?
No. I mean, we tried as an experiment using flat files in GitHub.
Oh, yeah.
So
we've done it both ways.
Yeah. So we went back to Markdown in the Google Doc. I did take a look at HackMD, and I mean I haven't actually logged into it because it seems like we'd have to pay for it in order to get the public functions, and we're already getting a public shareable, editable document with Google Docs. So I mean, I'm willing to, continue looking into HackMD. Okay, you're talking to HackMD. Okay, great. Yeah. So, so I mean, if that's an option, great, let's try it. But I think we've established conclusively that keeping it in GitHub is not going to work.
Yeah. We've done it both ways, and both ways have failed about equally miserably. So
well, this way actually, I'm going to say no, because that's not entirely true. Last time we did it with basically Google formatting that we then had to convert to Markdown at the last minute. What we did this time is we just took the Markdown and dropped it into a Google document and edited as Markdown in the Google document, and then we were able to pretty much just dump it over. And Misty did have to make a few tweaks to it, but not nearly the horrible half-a-day conversion job I had to do last time.
Yeah, and the tweaks that I had to make, I would have had to mostly make anyway, because they have to do with like templating stuff that we need for Hugo that wouldn't actually look right in the changelog on GitHub. So that, don't consider that a blocker.
Great. All right, we have to wrap up. I have to go start SIG architecture. Everybody, thank you so much for another amazing release. You all deserve great props for delivering a day off, which is incredible. Again, how many enterprises with people being forced to do this are that successful at meeting their deadlines? Best community ever, best release team ever, best everything. You guys are just amazing. I love you all, and I'm really privileged to be part of this community. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for just our amazing community of contributors, because that's the other big part of it. It's not just the release team. It's not even primarily the release team, but people were just super responsive to almost all of our requests. And that's what made this really successful.
All right, great. Thank you, everybody. Happy Thursday.
Thank you. Bye.